The Department of Office of Management and Budget here at the city is a key department in the city because it gives or articulates the monies, where they come, where they go, and also how residents relate to that. Now with us here in studio is the department head of that department, one Mr. Austin Michaels. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well, Chris. How about yourself?
I'm doing quite well. Now, one of the key components of your department is the presentation of the CAFR report, also known as the Consolidated Annual Financial Report. But, many persons have questions about that report because there's so many numbers in it. It has a lot of trends and forecasts. So we're glad to have you here to sort of demystify that report for us.
Sure. So I always like to tell people where the money's coming from. Yeah. And then how we're using that money to provide services to our residents and our community. Those are the main functions. It is, as you said, just a snapshot as of June 30th. For this one, it's 2019. But it also shows the changes over that past year. What it fails to capture is where we're going into the future. It really is just that 1 year period and kind of where we're at. So I always like to look at everything with a goal towards sustainability in the future.
Now, before we take a deep dive into this report, there's a lot of team building and involvement that happens with this. Kind of talk about, from the team perspective, your staff and what's involved in putting this report together.
Absolutely. There are literally thousands of hours go into this report. My deputy director, Finanacial, this is her baby. She spends hours and hours and hours making sure that it is as perfect as it can be. I've got a wonderful staff that supports this. There's the accounting team, the accounts payable, the purchasing department, and then all the city departments that we have to work with. This really is a concerted effort. There's a lot of information that's gathered not only throughout the year but at year end to get this into good shape. We have the guidance of the City Council overall and then the Council Finance Committee. They have a big part to play in this. On a monthly basis, we get together and discuss where we're at and how things are going. So their support is key in this. And then, of course, the city administration, kind of guiding the whole thing.
Now, in terms of where the money comes from, we know that it covers like general fund revenues, expenditures, pension systems. It gets into the retiree health care. Let's get into, where does the money come from?
Sure. So I like to focus on the general fund because that's the general operations of the city. And primarily where our money comes from, where our operating income is sourced, is property taxes. So of the $76 million that the general fund brought in revenues this year, 62% or $47 million of that was generated from property taxes. And that's our residents as well as our businesses contributing to that. The closest second to that would be state funding, which is right around $8.5 million. So as you can see, there's a big jump there. So we are heavily reliant on property taxes.
Where does the money go?
Where does the money go? Excellent question. So, just like we have one primary source of funds coming in, the property taxes, generally what we do is we provide services to the residents and the community. And the biggest service that we provide is public safety. Public safety makes up about 74% of general fund expenditures. So of the $68 million that we spent this year, about $50 million of that was spent on public safety. That's your community policing, that's your fire, that's your emergency preparedness.
There was much discussion, especially when we were in the recession several years ago, in terms of how the city was impacted by that. Where are we now with that?
So we are recovering, but it is a very slow recovery because of Proposal A, which limits the amount we're allowed to increase property taxes year over year. There is actually quite a gap between what we used to base our property taxes on, the state equalized value, which is tied to market value, and then the actual taxable value. And that gap has been growing considerably year over year and is expected to continue to grow. I think since 2009, when we had the economic downturn, we've lost about $85 million in property tax revenue that would have been generated.
Yes. Now, one thing that you get from this report, and just your position with the city, is that you have to be sort of at the forefront of forecasting trends.
My word that I like to focus on is sustainability. So you have to project things going forward. My office is also responsible for coordinating the annual budget process, and we like to try to look forward as much as we can in that process to see, how are we expecting things to change? Are we expecting our outflows to, greatly increase where our inflows are going to be limited? So there is a lot of projection that goes into that. One of the things that we have to consider with that is our legacy costs, our pension and our retiree health care.
Right. And let's talk a little bit about that model of sustainability. If you could take an element of some of these figures in this report, what's one example that would let a listener know that this is a very sustainable and a very responsible civic financial model?
Sure, so that's when we tend to get away from the revenues and expense side of things and look at our balance sheet, our financial position as of the year end, specifically with regards to what some might refer to as the rainy day funds. That's our fund balance and where we are in line with best practices, where comparable cities of our size and our service model are at, and we are at a strong position. Yes. It did take some years to recover from the recession, but we are once again well positioned.
Yes, and many of the elected leadership here have raved about your ability to just really be almost all-knowing about where the other cities are and how we relate to that. We seem to be at the upper tier financially in comparison to other cities. So talk about that a little bit.
Sure. One of the things I like to point out is our healthcare, our retiree healthcare. We were in a fortunate position several years back where we did some pre-funding of that liability. We knew we were going to have to pay into the future, so we set some money aside. There are many cities comparable to the Southfield in Michigan that did not do that. Yeah. Recently, the state passed a act requiring a certain funding level for our pensions and our retiree health care, and because of that pre-funding that we did, we are in a much better position sustainability-wise than a number of our peers.
Absolutely. Now, another thing that you've been lauded for, too, in terms of giving figures that inform council on what they should do in terms of staffing, because we have not had to do layoffs like other cities
Correct.
have. We've been able to avoid a lot of that, and a lot of that is due to the work of your department and your staff as well. Talk about that, how we've been able to avoid major cuts, layoffs, major budget cuts.
Sure. So when we were going through the economic downturn, following the Great Recession, one of the things that the city administrator at the time had said was, we're not going to lay people off. We're going to find a way to do this. And I think we can see that throughout the city, where just through attrition and not filling vacancies, people were picking up the slack. We had, people that were doing things that weren't necessarily part of their original job, but they were doing it because it was the right thing to do. Yeah. And I think that throughout the city, the departments have kind of carried that mentality forward. Fortunately, we are in a position to where we can get back to our previous staffing levels, but we also take a good hard look at that. Anytime the question of a new position comes up, we look at, okay, how is this going to benefit our residents? How is this going to be sustainable going forward?
Now, lastly, what's one thing that you would like to say to residents, to business, to people who live, work, and play in the city in terms of our sustainability, our fiscal health moving forward? What would you like to say to them about that?
Sure. So what I would say is that we are in a good position. We are well positioned for the future. And I encourage people to ask questions. I encourage people to reach out to us, if they don't understand something. I love it when a resident comes in and says, hey, I'm looking at the budget. Can you just tell me what this, and this means? Yeah. I sit down with them for 5-10 minutes. They walk out of there going, good, I feel better. And that's why we're here. We are, here to serve.
Well, Austin, thank you so much for coming down to the Cable 15 studios.
Thank you very much for having me.
And anytime you want to come back, your name is on the back of that chair.